Good evening, everyone. All right, just making sure that you guys can hear me. If you can hear me, put a one in the chat. All right, excellent. All right, so good evening, everyone. I just want to, first of all, kick off things. It's 8:08. And as usual, before we start anything else, let's start off with the word of prayer.
Recording in progress.
A word of prayer which will be done by Pastor Kerry Kerr. Kerry, are you there?
Let us pray. Almighty God, let us pray. Almighty God, we are grateful for an opportunity to be here this evening at the Internet Governance Forum. We invite you, O God, to lead us and be with the presenters, be with those who have joined us via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. Help us to have an enjoyable time. In Jesus' most precious name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Kerr. That was very good. So with that being done, I just want to welcome everyone officially to the third IGF in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And tonight, I have the distinct benefit of welcoming you all to the first in the two-part series under the theme, The Use of Emerging Technologies for Disaster Resilience, which is a quite pertinent topic, you would say, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, given challenges that we continue to face in these times. My name is Andrew Brown, and I am your moderator this evening. We have a quite distinguished panel this evening with Carla James, Executive Director of the FSA, and Mr. Marlo Brown, one of the directors of PACEWIF. But before we get into the action, there's a couple of remarks that would have to be made by starting off firstly with our IGF local coordinator, Mr. Williams.
Good evening, everyone. It is indeed a pleasure for me and the IGF, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, to be hosting this event this afternoon. We have had a number of false starts over the last 2 years. Of course, due to the numerous events and mishaps and disasters that befell the world and St. Vincent and the Grenadines in particular. I'm speaking particularly of our volcanic eruption. We have had to postpone and cancel and so on. Thank God, though, today, through the resilience of a vibrant ISOC membership and its IGF governance committee, we are able to host this event. And I'm already anticipating the success it's going to be today. Just the fact that we're having it despite all the odds is cause for great applause. ISOC, actually the IGF is really an event that brings together people to speak about issues affecting the governance and administration of the internet, policies, that affect us all and policies that affect us on our day-to-day interaction with the internet. And this affects electronic transactions. It affects the movement of money. It affects education. It affects entertainment and a broad spectrum of our everyday lives. And as a result, most of these things are going to be discussed over the next 2 days. We're going to see what problems we have and how they can be solved, what we can change, how we can mitigate. And in our discussion, note is going to be taken and used in higher forums to advance the cause and to come up with solutions. I therefore look forward to this session. I anticipate vibrant discussion, ample questions, and useful answers and solutions coming up. I'm hoping that we'll have a splendid afternoon today and tomorrow. And with that, I should just say thank you and all the best.
Thank you, Willis. That was a good way to start us off. Next, we would head into our feature presentation from, I hope I pronounced this name right, Mr. Chingatai Masango, who is the head of the IGF Secretariat. So we just sit back, relax, and enjoy this presentation from him.
Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to join you today for the 2021 edition of St. Vincent and the Grenadines IGF. We have been living in probably the most challenging of times in the last decade. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted our lives on all fronts. And the strength of your people and of your beautiful country was even additionally tested by the forces of nature. The resilience you have shown in fighting the pandemic and the volcanic eruption is impressive. My sympathies and best wishes in these difficult times are with the people of your country, particularly those that still await to return to their homes. We, the people working in internet governance circles, just by the nature of our work, are aware of the transformative power digital technologies have. But you will agree with me, not many outside of our circles are. If there is at least one good outcome of these issues that the pandemic has brought to us, then it is the situational awareness and having people understanding better the ways that digital technologies work for us. We have all witnessed schools, hospitals, public administrations, and trade continuing in times of confinement. The internet, its tools and services enable that. But again, not everybody was enabled, and certainly not all on an equal footing. Due to the digital divide, many are forced to just stop everything and survive while waiting for better days to come. This happened in rural and remote areas where the internet infrastructure is not deployed. It happened also in many parts of the world where the basic connectivity was in place, but skills on how to use it were not. It especially happened to people with disabilities, many women, the elderly population, refugees and migrants, and many other vulnerable and marginalized groups. It is critical to take a proactive role in ensuring the humanitarian, health and environmental or any other form of crisis is informed, prevented, and responded to through the lens of digital technologies. This is because of the immense power of digital technologies. For example, big data analytics can help us predict harms or respond to them more effectively. Aerial robotics can help us reach many people in need. Good public policies are a guarantee of meaningful, timely, and safe actions, including in the digital sphere. The 16th annual IGF meeting will be focusing on this. Its issue area program will allow us to understand the practical concepts of meaningful access, economic and social inclusion, respect for human rights online, the role of emerging technologies, the necessity of digital cooperation, and building trust. It will be hosted by the Government of Poland in Katowice from 6 to 10 December. Its hybrid format will allow for meaningful online and on-site participation. I hope that many of you will join us. In the meantime, the work of our intersessional work streams is underway. We are continuously working with people around the globe on best practice forums on cybersecurity and gender online, and policy networks on environment and access. I invite all of you to actively contribute to these processes as well. You are a community that knows the side of the internet that many do not. You experience as an island nation the specificities of access and connectivity, and as a country combating natural disasters, the role of the internet in responding to those. The world can learn from you, which can be done through the IGF. We would like to exchange views with you on how to do this, and because of that, we will host tomorrow a session at 6 p.m. Please visit the program and join our dialogue tomorrow. I am looking forward to your meeting and its many important discussions. I hope that many of you will actively participate in the IGF 2021 and bring critical outputs from this meeting to the IGF. Thank you very much for inviting me to address you, and all the best in your deliberations.
All right. So thank you for that presentation. I know you could not be here with us, but we appreciate that you sent such words that encourage us and made us realize how much we factor into the larger IGF international game plan. So now we'll be heading into the part of the evening, which is the panel discussion. Before we head into that, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. We will be taking questions at the end of both presentations. So that is, both speakers would make their presentations, and then afterwards we'll have the question and answer session. You can submit your questions on any platform that you are on, whether it's Facebook, whether you're in the Zoom, or whether you are on YouTube. Just correct me if I'm right, engineer? Yes, so you submit your questions as they come to you while the persons are speaking, but we will deal with them after both presenters have gone. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, the first presenter this evening is Miss Carla James. Carla James joined the FSA, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as Executive Director in September 2018. Ms. James is a barrister at law, solicitor, and notary public, and holds a LLB from UWI Cave Hill and an LEC from Hugh Wooding Law School. As Executive Director, she also holds the post of Registrar of IBCs, International Trusts, Mutual Funds and Credit Unions, and Commissioner of International Insurance. She is also a statutory member of the National Anti-Money Laundering Committee. Ms. James has worked in the field of financial services since 2003, specifically the detection and combating of financial crimes. Firstly, as the legal officer of the Financial Intelligence Unit, known as one of the leading FIUs in the Caribbean, and then as its director from 2016 to 2018. She has also served as magistrate at the Kingston Magistrates Court for a period of 1.5 years, where she adjudicated on all aspects of the law. So without any further ado, Ms. Carla James.
Okay, good evening. And thank you for the opportunity to address members of ISOC and all participants at the Third National Internet Governance Forum. So I am presenting on the use of emerging technologies within St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but particularly as it relates to the regulation of such technologies within the context of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and in particular mobile payment service providers. Okay, so to provide a little bit of background on the FSA, who we are, the FSA is a statutory body which was established by an act of parliament in 2011. It's a single financial services regulatory authority, the only one in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And the FSA commenced formal operations on the 12th of November 2012, and it's brought together by the commencement of those operations 3 distinct regulatory bodies which were previously in existence: the International Financial Services Authority, IFSA, the Cooperatives Division of the Ministry of National Mobilization, and the Supervisory and Regulatory Division within the Ministry of Finance. The role and function of the FSA, our mandate, is to supervise and regulate the operations of specified non-bank financial entities and to promote stability, public awareness, public confidence in the operations of operators who are licensed with us. We are also responsible for ensuring that each licensed entity is properly managed and remains financially sound. And we also are responsible for monitoring and ensuring compliance by those financial entities with AML CFT laws, anti-money laundering, counter-financing of terrorism laws. The FSA is guided by core principles which it shall, in exercising its functions, it must have regard to. And just to name a few of those: the reduction of risk to the public of financial loss due to dishonesty or incompetence of persons providing financial services in and from within St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the protection and enhancement and reputation and integrity of St. Vincent and the Grenadines in financial matters, the need to counter financial crimes, both in St. Vincent and elsewhere, the stability and security of the financial services sector, protection and fair treatment, the protection and fair treatment of customers of financial entities. And we do all of this with proportionate risk-based regulation. Our legislative mandate, we do have a few domestic as well as international laws with which we are responsible in regulating our entities. Under the domestic laws, the Financial Services Authority Act, which is of course our governing piece of legislation, the Cooperative Societies Act, the Insurance Act, Building Societies Act, Friendly Societies Act, the MSB Act, which you'll hear a little bit more about later on, the Money Services Business Act, and the international laws are also listed. So now we are going to speak specifically about mobile payment service providers. Now, these are new and emerging products in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which facilitate electronic transactions. And these are essentially defined as a digital payment system conducted from a mobile device, which allows users to carry out payment services and through which businesses and individuals can also send and receive money. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we are aware that there are currently 2 such entities in operation, and that's PaySwift and Squeeze Cash Limited. The FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, defines financial institutions to mean any natural or legal person that conducts as a business one or more of the following activities or operations for or on behalf of a customer. So apart from accepting deposits from the public, lending and financial leasing, there's also money or value transfer services, issuing and managing means of payments, and financial guarantees and commitments. So for the purposes of mobile service providers, we can clearly see that they fall within the definition. Well, they engaged in money or value transfer services and issuing and managing means of payment. And therefore, according to the FATF, these entities should be classified as financial institutions. And right, so I would have mentioned this before. MSBs must therefore, by virtue of the fact, MPSPs, sorry, the mobile payment service providers, must therefore, by virtue of the fact that they are classified as a financial institution, adhere to AML CFT preventive measures. For example, customer due diligence, record keeping, and reporting of suspicious transactions. So what are the pros and the cons of having these MPSPs operating within St. Vincent and the Grenadines and worldwide? The pros, as we know it, they are new and innovative ways of payment that offer an alternative to traditional financial services. Use of smartphone or device, so obviously ease of utility, obviously, convenient, easy to use, allows for financial inclusion. And when we say financial inclusion, we mean that essentially it is these types of services are able to reach persons who may not have access to the traditional financial system. So we're talking about the underserved, the unserved, the unbanked. The cons surrounding these types of service providers, there are anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism concerns. There are also know your customer concerns by virtue of the fact that these types of products and services are offered across multiple jurisdictions. It's usually quite difficult to understand who the customer is, and to also have an understanding of the source of the customer's funds. Transactions may be difficult to track, and for these very reasons, these types of services and products might be attractive for criminal behavior, such as money laundering and terrorist financing. There are also challenges presented to countries in developing effective anti-money laundering, counter-financing of terrorism, regulation of these types of products and services due to the nature and operation, the use of the new technologies to ensure that these products and services are not misused, as the potential does exist for money laundering and terrorist financing. Right, so I mentioned before that there is a potential, an opportunity does exist for money laundering and terrorist financing to occur utilizing these services, as it does similarly for traditional banking services. However, you would appreciate the distinction being that the banking sector is very strictly regulated. So the applicable legislation in St. Vincent as it relates to the AML CFT risks and countering those particular risks, the anti-money laundering, counter-financing of terrorism regulations, the anti-money laundering, counter-financing of terrorism code, and the terrorist financing and proliferation I should mention here that the mobile payment service providers fall within the definition within Schedule 1 of the AML-CFT regulations as service providers, which includes a person who conducts as business, electronic money, issuing and managing means of payment, etc. The FATF would have issued guidance for a risk-based approach to new payment products and services in 2013, and this would include these mobile payments and internet-based service providers, which the MPSPs would fit under that particular category. And the FATF, in its guidance, recognized the potential for these new payment methods to be misused by criminals. And the risk factors, of course, they identified can significantly differ from one new payment product or service to another, because you would appreciate that there would be several types of products which fall within the definition of new payment products and services. And the risk mitigants can be tailored to a particular payment product to mitigate its risk profile. So before I move from risk, I'll touch a little bit more on some of the potential AML-CFT risks that may present in relation to these types of products. Firstly, there's the non-face-to-face relationship. The fact that there's an absence of face-to-face contact may indicate an inherently higher risk. If CDD and verification measures do not adequately address the risk, then the money laundering and terrorist financing risk increases, as it may be difficult to trace funds, for instance. Whenever CDD is carried out by electronic verification, providers should ensure that the information relied upon is accurate and from reliable sources. Another risk factor is the geographical reach. The services which can be used to transfer funds globally or can be used in wide geographical areas with a large number of counterparties are more attractive to criminals for money laundering, terrorist financing purposes, more so than domestic business models. And providers located in one jurisdiction offering services to customers in another, which has weak AML-CFT controls, is also another element of the geographical risk. The method of funding is also another risk. It could be that there's anonymous sources of funding such as cash, which again increases the money laundering terrorist financing risk if you are not certain of the identity of the customer on the other end, as well as the source of the funds, etc. And record keeping, transaction monitoring, and reporting. The keeping of transaction and customer due diligence records are critical to AML-CFT efforts and support law enforcement investigations. And in most jurisdictions in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there are record keeping requirements for a minimum period of 7 years. And the relevant records which should be kept are identification, information on customers, accounts, nature of the transactions, the quantum transferred, etc. So I'll now touch a little bit more on the AML-CFT requirements as are highlighted within the AML-CFT legislation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So there are know your customer provisions, risk-based KYC policies and procedures, which include customer due diligence, enhanced due diligence, and ongoing monitoring of customers. And it's important to note that the use of agents and the reliance of third parties for establishing customer relationships, especially when spread across several countries, would increase the money laundering and terrorist financing risk. So a service provider, in this case, the MPSPs, because they would be expected to comply with the AML-CFT legislation in St. Vincent, they must understand the nature of the customer's activities, establish the source of funds, especially for high-risk customers, assess the money laundering risk associated with the customer for the purposes of monitoring the customer's activities and establish the customer identity. So these are all a part of customer due diligence measures, KYC and customer identity, identifying and verifying the client's identity when opening an account and periodically over time. And the collection and verification of identification information includes keeping information such as the full name, the country of birth and nationality of the customer, the address, the date of birth, telephone number, and email address. And validation of customer information, it is usually best practice that 2 pieces of identification are collected by a service provider, preferably one being to verify the identity and the second piece being to, one being to identify the customer firstly, and the second being to verify the identity of that customer. And it is usually, again, strongly recommended that government issued IDs are accepted. And in the case of these new and emerging technologies, such as the MPSPs, we would expect that digital IDs, digital scans of government issued IDs, for instance, would be accepted in the circumstances, given that the customers may not be obviously before you. We've already established that this will be a non-face-to-face type of relationship. And preferably a proof of address, which is usually established by utility bill, for instance. Okay, and there would also be requirements for KYCC in some instances, which is knowing your customer's customer. And this is this involves an assessment by the financial institution of who is the customer's customer, who the customers are doing business with, and their sources of funds and legitimacy, and the risk that these third parties might be laundering money. Financial institutions must be aware of who their customers are doing business with to avoid nefarious business dealings, money laundering, and reputational damage. And the same identification documents as are required for KYC would usually be taken for KYCC. We spoke about record keeping briefly earlier and the records that are required to be kept. And this is, as I indicated, a requirement under the AML CFT legislation in St. Vincent, the customer due diligence documentation that is taken, transaction activity, and any complaints and investigations on the customers. And there will also be a requirement to report suspicious transactions. So we spoke earlier about transaction monitoring and reporting. So that is a requirement. And with these new and emerging technologies, it is anticipated that it will not necessarily be the easiest thing to do, but we have to find a way in which we can do so. Okay, and there would also be a requirement for training of the personnel who are employed with the MPSPs, and a competent and experienced compliance officer must be appointed. And this is somebody who ideally should be in a senior position, someone who's familiar with the laws, the AML CFT laws in the jurisdiction, and who would be the point of contact with the financial intelligence unit, the person responsible for ideally reporting suspicious transactions to the FIU. So there's a requirement in the regulations for the appointment of a money laundering reporting officer, as well as a money laundering compliance officer, but these roles can be merged into one. So now we'll go into the regulation and supervision of these types of businesses, the MPSPs. So we spoke earlier about the definition by virtue of what these types of entities engage in. They will, within the context of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, be fit more aptly under the Money Service Business Act. And money services business is defined in that act as the business of providing any or all of the following services. And the important one here would be the transmission of money or monetary value in any form. And so by virtue of that particular definition, it is clear that the MPSPs are engaging in money services business and therefore fall within the Money Service Business Act. And transmission of money within the act means the acceptance and transfer of currency, funds, or other value that substitutes for currency to another location or person by any means. Now, the importance of regulation of these types of entities is critical because it ensures sound usage and public safety by appropriate regulatory oversight. Another advantage to having regulation of these entities, bringing them into the regulated financial sector, further reinforces AML CFT safeguards. Regulatory oversight also gives financial institutions the requisite measure of comfort and assurance of legitimacy to interact with these types of businesses. And partnership with financial institutions is critical in order for these businesses to effectively operate in the financial space. So now we'll talk a little bit about the current entry requirements as they exist under the MSB Act. And we have had meetings with Marlo and Jamal from PaySwift, and so we would have pointed out these particular requirements to them previously. And these are the application. There is an application form to be completed, a non-refundable application fee, and that's currently $3,000, an annual license fee of $10,000. A personal questionnaire has to be completed by directors and senior management, the shareholders of the entity, as well as senior management. Net worth, there must be net worth, there is a net worth requirement of currently of $100,000. A statutory deposit as well of $100,000 in cash, government securities, or any other form approved by the minister. There must be a compliance officer in place. A business plan should be submitted to the FSA for review and assessment as a part of the application process, and an AML CFT policy and procedures manual, which has to be reviewed and assessed as well by the FSA. Now, it's important to note that fit and proper assessments must be undertaken of all of the directors and senior management of the entity, and the FSA as regulator would have to satisfy itself that these persons, the mind and management and of the entity are of sound reputation, and there are no criminal convictions against any of these individuals, excluding, of course, minor traffic offenses. And there, with the application, there would be an expectation that a police record would be submitted as well as proof of qualifications. So a thorough assessment of the persons behind these types of businesses would have to be conducted by the FSA prior to an application being granted and an entity being licensed. Now, the challenges that we envision for these MPSPs, particularly in meeting the requirements under the legislation in St. Vincent, first of all, the lack of physical space, because there is a requirement that there must be a physical location within St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the fulfilling of the AML CFT requirements, which we spoke about earlier. We acknowledge that these are non-face-to-face type arrangements. We know that the customers may not be here. It might be difficult to keep and store the records. at least in the manner that is currently anticipated by the existing legislation. Cost of entry requirements. We realize that the application fee currently, as well as the annual licensing fee, the net worth requirement, the statutory deposit requirements, these may all be cost prohibitive for new and emerging businesses, young entrepreneurs who may be seeking to set up these types of businesses. It may be a deterrent. International obligations on intermediary and local banks, corresponding banking requirements, and KYCC concerns. So these may be very critical concerns for financial institutions who may be considering or contemplating onboarding these types of businesses, MPSPs. They may be thinking these types of businesses, what they do, they are relatively new, they are unknown, the risk hasn't been completely assessed, there is the potential for money laundering, terrorist financing, and currently they are unregulated. Therefore, they may be viewed with some hesitancy, at least until such time as regulation can be undertaken. The requirements of the licensing, as we mentioned, may be a little bit onerous currently. And the FSA is currently undertaking a review of the MSB Act. And the intention is to provide for various classes of licenses. And we are also reviewing the financial requirements for new entrants. And what we hope to, the intention ultimately is to apply varying fee structures to make the licensing process less onerous and more financially inclusive to smaller entrepreneurs. We also are looking at a revision in the statutory deposit to allow for a reduced sum to be increased over a 3-year period up to the maximum of 100,000, but not initially for startup businesses to have to pay that 100,000. We can also look at alternative ways of establishing net worth. We can do a subjective assessment and not apply strictly, not apply the legislation strictly as it currently is. Well, at least an amendment can be made to ensure that there's provision for that. And we may also have to consider bespoke guidelines for AML CFT following a careful identification, assessment, and understanding of the money laundering and terrorist financing risks faced, and the adoption of appropriate measures to mitigate the risks identified. And the ultimate goal, as we say, as we've indicated, is to tailor regulation to mitigate the risk of the product without imposing an undue regulatory burden that could stifle innovation. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. James. That was a very, very enlightening presentation. Some key takeaways I took from that were, regulation assures the safety. And I think sometimes we, as a public, don't recognize that enough. But I also like the fact that the FSA is actually prepared to move in a direction to be more accommodating to smaller businesses. So, it's very good to hear that. Moving on. Our next presenter is Mr. Marlo Brown, sorry. No relation, I don't think. But Marlo Brown is a technology specialist with over a decade of successful experience in ICT training, technological development, and implementation. Marlo co-founded PaySwift in 2014 with Jamal Glasgow to aid St. Vincent and the Grenadines in digital transactions. The project was awarded a CARSIP grant and has won an award for the most innovative in the World Summit Awards of 2017. He is a strong believer in the power of critical thinking when it comes to problems In his career as a lecturer for the St. Vincent and the Grenadines National Center of Technological Innovation, he has helped the company to achieve great accomplishments, such as training the trainers and assisted the company in the award for the most regional passes in CompTIA. Mr. Marlo Brown.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Brown. First, I would like to greet everybody who is directly in front of me here tonight. And of course, I'd like to greet the viewers that are at home or wherever it is that you are viewing this virtually. And of course, I'd like to apologize for Mr. Glasgow not being here at this time. There are other pressing matters that he had to attend to. So I'm here to deal with this today, okay? The topic that we got was the use of emerging technology for disaster resilience. I want to talk to you about the company that me and Mr. Glasgow built. We built a parent company called Research Innovate Lifestyle, and that company would research on problems that it's seeing within St. Vincent and the Grenadines, create innovative technology to have a positive impact on people's lives right here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And through that company was the birth of PaySwift back in 2014. Now, of course, we've taken quite some time to develop PaySwift into what it is today. Now, when we talk about disaster resilience, no person or country is immune from disasters or disaster-related losses, whether it be infectious diseases, outbreaks, acts of human terrorism, social unrest, or financial disasters, in addition to natural hazards, can all lead to large-scale consequences for our country and for the communities within it. The world that we live in at this current time is faced with various challenges, and some of these challenges you're already aware of, some has already passed, and some will come again. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic. Through the COVID-19 pandemic, this has increased lines and caused bottlenecks and slowed down or halted some services that are supposed to be given right here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It has also slowed down business growth. And in some cases, for those businesses that take an advantage of e-commerce, they were able to grow during that period and keep their head above water. COVID also hindered educational and social experiences that we're accustomed to and what we're accustomed to have right here in St. Vincent. Another disaster that transpired right here in St. Vincent is the La Soufrière eruption. And that caused a lot of displacement within communities and families. And finally, the other example I'm going to bring is the hurricane, floods, or storms that we experience on occasion, especially during our hurricane season. And we're pretty famous for flash floods and landslides. These damage homes and cause persons to be immobile during that moment or period. Now, all those things that I mentioned before, when it comes down to it, is going to need some form of financial support. Now, communities and our countries would face, and our government themselves will face difficult choices that they're going to have to make, whether it's social, cultural, environmental choices. As seen today, we're now following the COVID-19 protocols. Everybody is masked up. We spend 2 to 3, 3 to 4 feet apart from each other. Some clubs have decided to have virtual clubs, and we're seeing that the government and persons around are trying to make the best choices. And these best choices will deal with basic security, whether it may be simple as securing food or as simple as just trying to secure the money that I already have in my pocket. And of course, this is all going to be towards our quality of life against hazards and future disasters or the current disaster that we're facing. Now, what transpired during those disasters, especially COVID-19 and the La Soufrière eruption, was the use of virtual space. The space that we all now have become accustomed to is the internet. And the internet has given us a vast means of communication In my line of work, we consider this to be an advanced form of communication. And with this advanced form of communication, we have created back our communities, we have created jobs, we have created back some form of education, and we have created another form of social experiences. And this was all done because of the internet. And of course, with those type of things, we're going to have something called a payment gateway. Here is where PaySwift lies. Here is where PaySwift helped to facilitate the digital transactions that is going to be needed for our current situations and for the future situations. Now, if there's one thing that I've realized, regardless of whatever situation that we're experiencing as it pertains to disasters, money will always be a factor in supporting resilience. As we've seen with our Prime Minister and our neighboring countries, they all try to seek aid, whether it's physical aid in the sense of beds, food supply, whatever it is. We also seek aid in monetary transaction. Now, we will try to enhance resilience by anticipating disasters through other means of technology. For example, there's satellite, there are things that would allow us to know, rain is about to come, etc. And that will help us to better reduce disaster or prepare better. If we know, for example, there's a hurricane, we'll definitely go outside and buckle down the roof. But sometimes we need to think about what we're going to do now so that we could prepare for a disaster. And what we're trying to think about is it's best to prepare for it than to be in a situation where you have to pay for everything after. Now, things that I mentioned before, such as the use of the virtual space, has brought jobs. It has brought various other companies to light, such as online shopping, such as grocery shopping, ordering online, booking of a particular teacher to teach your children at a particular time. And we're seeing all of this actually transpiring right now in St. Vincent. Some persons are taking PaySwift as the opportunity to have social experiences. For example, they might have a virtual soccer scenario as seen before that now we no longer have Carnival in play. So some persons might have to enjoy Carnival online, right? And maybe they might have to pay for that DJ to play the music. How are they going to pay for it? So with how things are currently, our people in St. Vincent and Grenadines are actually practicing enhanced resilience. This is whereby we save. We put ourselves in a situation whereby if something like this is to happen again, we know what it is we can do to generate funds, to still have that community, that social experience, to still have a job. So although disasters will continue to occur, actions that could move our country from a reactive approach to disasters to a proactive stance where communities actively engage in a virtual community will enhance resilience and will reduce many of our incoming problems or release some of the burden as we pertain to money and how we would spend. Now, the time that we created PaySwift, the goal of PaySwift was to level the playing field for the ordinary man. The concept behind of it was completely through e-commerce. We have recognized in St. Vincent during our research with Research Innovate Lifestyle that majority of business do not promote anything online. We realize that websites are just created for the purpose of viewing and gathering information. But the way in which the world acts today, the website is meant to actually do the work so that the individual doesn't have to do it anymore. Now, here is an example that we're seeing that is actually happening when it comes to business growth. When we think about e-commerce in St. Vincent, we really need to think about a way that a business could sell its goods and service to persons in St. Vincent and outside St. Vincent. If we're to think about a business only selling within St. Vincent, the scale in which the business could grow is limited. If, however, the market is outside of St. Vincent or international, that means the business have a great potential growth. Now, one of the problems that PaySwift is facing is what they call third-party transactions. And I want to thank Ms. James for her presentation and letting us know that there are going to be some works that are going to be done within the FSA. We have had previous meetings, multiple meetings before, and it's good to know that there is something in the making. But we want to also let persons know that it's, when we talk about e-commerce is to really level the playing field for any individual. I am supposed to be able to sell my pepper sauce to somebody overseas. Should I be looking for the person ID, 2 forms of ID, proof of address for the person that is living in the States? We're seeing how Amazon is growing. We see how Alibaba is growing. We see how these websites are growing. We see how they're able to turn over very fast. I do not think the persons that are there know exactly who they're selling to. Maybe there's a framework where we need to work with so that this could be more streamlined. But at the end of the day, I'm glad that FSA is making some strides towards this. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlo. You know, I like to talk about creating a virtual space to replicate our real life spaces. And it sounds like PaySwift is on its way to being a part of that. That question at the end, you know, as it relates to how international bodies relate to, or how they work around this KYC is an interesting one. It's something I never thought about before, but it is a very interesting fact. And perhaps it's something that we could use as we head into we're a little bit early, but we're actually heading into our question and answer period. And I actually see one question here. I'm not sure who it's going to be directed to. Maybe we could throw it out to both panelists. But the question is, apart from the fact that Dcash is a product of the ECCB, how is it different to PaySwift? And just a reminder to all those who are listening out there or watching, you can drop your questions in any of the platforms that you have. So you can drop them in on YouTube, whether you're in on the Zoom itself, or if you are on Facebook, you can drop your questions there and we'll have the panelists answer them. So just once more again, let me repeat this question here. It says, apart from the fact that Dcash is a product of the ECCB, how is it different to PaySwift? Start with you, Marlo, and then. All
right. I would believe that the ECCB may have had or found ways in which there's a framework for that currency to run. It was created by ECCB, so they will have a better understanding of what framework they could use. Besides the fact that it came from ECCB, PaySwift and Dcash is very similar in the way in which they conduct business. It's the concept of sending and receiving money abroad or regional. It's pretty much the same factor. It's backed by the same EC dollar. So I would believe there would be some form of framework or something regulatory involved. I'm not sure exactly what that is as yet.
Right. I am not necessarily best placed to answer this question, I would say. A representative from the ECCB perhaps maybe should have been invited to this forum for that type of question. But what I can say based on my limited knowledge is that Dcash, as I understand it, is a digital form of the Eastern Caribbean currency, whereas Pay Swift and Squeeze Cash are mobile payment service providers, which to me it's a little bit different, even though you're saying that you're backed by DC dollar and you're engaged in the same sending and receiving. I still see a slight distinction there. But as I say, in terms of great detail on Dcash, etc., I am not best placed to answer.
Okay, thank you. I think you guys handled that question very well. It was a bit of a curveball, but you handled it well. I actually have a couple of questions as well from my own listening. So this first one is for actually Marlo again. So you mentioned that the digital version of the world, right, can help us when it comes to setting up or recovering from a disaster. So I guess what I wanted to know is, in the case of an emergency, what resiliency you have in place for your technology in terms of if there's a disaster and it affects, servers and stuff. How is that? How are you guys handling that?
Okay, so we've had disasters in St. Vincent and Grenadines, and we recognize that some of these services that do not go out right away would be access to internet. Those of us who have mobile phones and have been utilizing payment plans, or even just buy a plan, which regardless of whichever ISP you choose to get. And because the way in which PaySwift was created, it followed a lot of the standards that would be within the United States, because there wasn't much for us to follow with. So we had to follow those standards until further notice. And those standards basically allowed us to create a situation whereby even though once you have internet access, PaySwift will always be running. So even though there is a storm, or in the case where there was a volcanic eruption, or even the pandemic with COVID-19, or even if there's a flood, parcels were still using PaySwift to do some of its features, like, for example, recharge their mobile phone or recharge a friend's mobile phone. They were able to use it to access the funds that are on their account to pay, let's say, the light bill, the water bill, or even send money to a friend or a family member. Some of them might have been in Kingston, needed somebody in, let's say, Georgetown to get some money. They were able to send that funds to them. So it was going back and forth from that angle. Through these type of disasters, the only how PaySwift would genuinely be affected is if the loss of internet completely occurred.
All right, thanks. Any? I guess not. All right. Okay, so my other question, which I had for Ms. James, is, so you mentioned a lot of the regulations. So I guess I wanted to know right now, what are the implications of one of these MPSPs running afoul of these legislations? Is there like penalties that they would face? And secondly, as a addendum to that, what happens to St. Vincent if we are not compliant, or these MPSPs are not compliant?
Okay, thanks. Well, firstly, the situation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is that these types of entities are actually not, in fact, regulated. And that isn't, as I indicated earlier, it's a new and emerging technology. So it wasn't something which was necessarily anticipated or provided for. So hence the reason why these types of entities, having been established and coming on the scene, they were not brought initially within the regulatory framework of any of the existing pieces of legislation. So they are currently not regulated in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Are they technically in breach of the legislation? I would say no, they are not at the moment. Because they have been from the very outset expressing interest and have been having discussions, as Marlo indicated, with the FSA as well as with the Ministry of Finance to find out how can they become regulated? And we are, as I indicated, the FSA is very much inclined to work with these types of entities to ensure that they do come within a regulatory framework. And of course, the jurisdiction is in a position where it is only just having to undertake an assessment of the risk that these types of products and services essentially would bring to the jurisdiction. So there are new and emerging technologies. There is provision for these types of businesses within the Financial Action Task Force recommendations to bring them within a regulatory framework, both for the purposes of AML CFT as well as for prudential regulation. And that is what we are seeking to do now in St. Vincent and the Grenadines with these types of entities.
And the other part in terms of the
well, so your addendum was in relation to if they were in fact in breach.
Well, let's say any
right. Well, if it is that an institution is found to be in breach of any of the pieces of legislation under which it's regulated, the FSA as the regulator has certain powers open and available to it under the FSA Act, which is the enabling legislation. We can suspend or cancel licenses. That's one option that's open to us. We can also take over the management of an entity. We can charge the principals of the entity, for instance. So those are the, and if there are AML CFT breaches, currently we do not have administrative powers which allow us to issue fines to entities for that purpose. But there are criminal sanctions available within the law. So it means that there would have to be a strong enough threshold of evidence to take before the court, essentially, to try to establish that these entities are criminally liable, ultimately.
Is there any other questions coming in? Okay. Oh, okay. All right, so I see a question here from Don Providence. All right. So it says, what is operational status of PaySwift in SVG? As we hear, they were forced to downgrade their operations in SVG. To be specific, could my friend in Taiwan send money to his friends in SVG? I guess that's for you, Mal.
Yes, that question is for me. So at this current point, PaySwift has grown to a stage where it has reached to a point where a lot of funds is coming in and out. And as a result, the local banks are now wanting to know the same thing that Ms. James mentioned, which is know your customer and know your customer. So because of correspondent banking, some of the features of PaySwift had to be disabled. And those features are just as what you wanted, which is the frame of mind where somebody overseas could actually send money to you directly. And then from there, you could then send it to your bank account. Unfortunately, PaySwift is not able to facilitate that at this point. However, that is something we're hoping that as we continue to see how things unfold in terms of framework and so forth, we could get that back on track. But as it is right now, those services has been disabled. Where PaySwift is currently, is in that we're in a stage of reform where we need to think about what can be done currently here in St. Vincent and what would be the best way forward.
All right, thanks. I have a question here. So my question is whether members in the ECCU use platforms like PayPal. I guess this is for the FSA. whether members in the ECCU use platforms like PayPal. If they do, what is preventing us from doing so, given we're also in the ECCU?
Right, based on my understanding, PayPal is currently offered in some territories of the ECCU to a limited extent. Some countries are able to send and receive utilizing the service, whereas others, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines, cannot do both. Now, we are still not quite certain as to the reason for that. I know that recently we have tried to reach out to the principals behind PayPal to get some clarity on why that is in fact so. But I am not able currently to offer an explanation as to why that is not permissible for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. No, it's not.
All right, thank you. Is there any more questions coming in on your platforms, guys? Okay. All right. Okay, so I have one other question for you, Ms. James. And I know sometimes when it comes to reforming laws and legislation, it takes some time. And I guess on behalf of Marlo, I want to ask, what time frame are we looking at for the reform of the MSB Act?
Okay, what I can say is that we've already drafted these amendments and they are currently with the board of the FSA for approval. Following that, the next anticipated stage would be, well, typically what the FSA would do would be to send out legislation to the sector to be impacted for consultation so that they would send feedback. But bearing in mind the importance as well as the critical need for these particular amendments, we can circumvent that process in this case and have the amendments go directly to the AG's chambers. And from there, of course, the policymakers have to have a say in this as well. The Minister of Finance is the minister responsible for the FSA. And ultimately, once it's laid before the House of Parliament, given the critical nature of these pieces, these amendments and the entities that it would impact, what we would envision happening, as tends to happen with these types of legislation, is that it would go to select committee. And at that point, the relevant persons would be invited to attend select committee and can then give their feedback. So that would be a faster way of getting it before Parliament and addressed as quickly as possible. As for time frame, once it leaves the FSA's hands, I have very little control over that. But what I hope for realistically, let's say about a 2 to 3 month turnaround.
So you see, Marlo, 2 to 3 months. All right, so okay. I have one question here from Maurice John, and I'm assuming that he's speaking from experience, but he asks, why do local banks block the purchase of cryptocurrency? I don't know. You want to take a stab at this? Block the purchase of cryptocurrency. Marley, I haven't spoken for a while, so I'm gonna.
PaySwift is in a fintech state, not crypto per se, but I would believe the same issues that are arising there would be the same issues with PayPal, which would be the same issues with us, which all them tied in together as one. So that could be one of the reasons there. I do believe St. Vincent is a little bit behind in terms of some of the things that we're supposed to get ahead of, but I do believe we're working towards it. And at some point, we'll reach to the stage where um, fintech industries, PayPal, cryptocurrency, all those things will become a part of St. Vincent and we could then move forward with it. But right now, we're still in the stage of developing that moment. I'm not sure if I'm answering Mr. John's question, but correctly. I'm not sure if you want to weigh in on this. But I believe it's all correlated to the same issues with PaySwift, with PayPal, with your cryptocurrency. All of them I believe to be the same thing. Know your customer, customer, customer.
So yeah, just a reminder, guys, you can ask your question in any of the platforms that are available. So we are live on Facebook, we're on YouTube, and we're also on Zoom. You could use the Q&A button. If you feel like you want to ask it live on there, you can also raise your hand and jump in and ask the question to the panelists. As you can see, they're willing and raring to go. I'm just waiting for the questions from you guys. So, you know, we're talking about financial institutions in general in St. Vincent. And I think in particularly, we're talking about the two players in the mobile financial arena. But is there anything that is preventing, besides the fact that the you guys are new to the game, is there anything that's preventing the larger institutions from doing work with you? Because as was mentioned before by Ms. James, there's not really a legislation that's governing you or that you're running afoul of. So what do you think is the reason for that lack of I guess cooperation on that end?
I did not have any problems with their website at all, and I was delivered whatever service or goods was promised. So it's definitely going to take some work for us to reach to that stage, but that's the stage PISF would like us to reach, where persons are able to sell their goods and services online. We understand that when money comes from overseas to St. Vincent, it's a foreign exchange. If I'm able to work for myself, it alleviates a lot of problems for the country.
Just to say that I do agree to some extent that Sylvester may be behind it, and unknown, and they are operating in the financial space currently without being regulated. And I think that in and of itself poses a problem with the financial institutions and their correspondent banking relationships, their intermediaries, etc. These are relationships which they guard very closely and very dearly, and with good reason. Because these things are very difficult to come by, and unfortunately, despite the best of efforts, in Vincent and the Grenadines um, does have very robust AML CFT laws and procedures in place, and we have had them since 2001. We do have a very strong regulated financial sector. However, notwithstanding that, for some reason, this part of the globe is not necessarily viewed internationally as being a low risk um, jurisdiction, low risk area, low risk space for AML CFT. So we are sometimes viewed um, with skepticism. And for that reason, the financial institutions, I think, are um, being very guarded. But hopefully, with regulation of these types of businesses, we anticipate that that should give them some measure of comfort and make things certainly easier for entities like PaySwift to operate.
Okay. So what I was saying before is that one of the problems that PaySwift was encountering and has been encountering is know your customer, and then you need to know that customer. And the reality of things is that when a business starts, it's going to be difficult for a business to know its customer and then know its customer, especially when you're dealing with online transactions. Um, when we look overseas, you're going to notice that you could go to any website that you feel comfortable with, and you basically purchase what it is you want to purchase. And the website does not even want to know your name. They just want you to purchase what you're intended to purchase. They don't need this, which will be two forms of ID, one to verify, one to identify, and then a billing information to say, here is where I'm living. So that is something that we're hoping as regulations come into place that we'll be able to move much faster on that. That could be a massive deterrent for any person who is shopping online overseas. The idea of PISF was to really level the playing field where regardless of what anybody is doing, honest living, of course, regardless of what they're doing, if it is that they're selling dasheen, or even if they're selling a bottle of pepper sauce at home, they make it at home, they're able to bottle it, follow the standards, ship it out accordingly, right? And of course, PISF will assist in facilitating the transaction, right? And the concept would have been that who wants to buy it would just pay for it, right? But like I said, the current issue here is know your customer and then know that customer. So as time go by, we're hoping that, as Ms. James said, regulations will come into play. And as I said before, St. Vincent is a little bit behind. It is sad that we're viewed as a little bit in a certain space that's not allowing us to be as free as we like to be. But I do believe that there are a lot of persons in St. Vincent with a lot of talent that could better themselves just through the talent alone.
Can I just add something based on what Marlo just said, right? Just to make the point that when persons would engage in online shopping, usually through different websites like Amazon, Alibaba, etc., utilizing their banking information. Remember, these persons tend to utilize either through PayPal or a Visa, debit card, MasterCard, etc. There's already an existing relationship with a financial institution. So there's a third party transaction which is conducted essentially. So there is a relationship there. So while it is, you may say, as the customer conducting this particular transaction online, that you're absolved of having to provide that information to the website. Remember that the website, the relationship, it already exists with the banking institution. So the banking institution then has that responsibility of remember, you have that account with the institution. So you are already the customer of the institution. The institution has the responsibility to engage in the customer due diligence requirements, KYC, etc., know the source of your funds, etc. So again, it goes back to the issue of you not being regulated and the challenges that come with that. But just to state that, to say that those entities are not concerned with it, there's a reason for that, because there is an existing relationship with a financial institution, and that element of CDD is taken care of through that third party relationship.
Thank you. Okay, so I see one question here. And there's a hand up. I believe this question from Don. I think it's kind of related to what we're talking about here. So Don wants to know the concept of KYC. How does this work in reality, especially as it pertains?
Right. So as I would have indicated in my presentation, KYC is a part of customer due diligence requirements. And as a part of KYC, essentially knowing who the customer is. Firstly, the financial institution or the service provider, as you may call them, they firstly must identify the customer, verify the customer's identity, determine the source of the customer's funds. So you would want to obviously know the employment history of the person, to know what their salary is like and the source of their funds. That would cover that as well as the fact of where does this customer live. So the absence of a credit bureau in St. Vincent and the Grenadines doesn't necessarily take away from KYC, because the institution would still have that obligation and can obtain the relevant pieces of information directly from a customer in order to establish KYC. As it into a financial institution, let's say for a particular type of product, like a mortgage or consumer loan, then is where your credit history becomes important to the financial institution. And in the absence of a credit bureau, the financial institutions do have their means of obtaining information from their counterparts on the credit history of particular customers or potential customers. So I don't know if that answers.
Okay, so see a hand up. You could just raise your see a hand up. You are. Oh, yeah. I guess I lost my my magic wand here. All right, so I see Mr. Maurice John with your hand up. So if you are prepared, you can jump in and ask us a question.
All right, so my question is, there are digital services that provide KYC. Is St. Vincent prepared to accept those digital platforms that offer that?
Sorry, Maurice. If
Hello?
you could just start over. If you could just start over, because we didn't catch the first part of your question.
Okay, so when I got interested in buying cryptocurrency, I had to be verified. My identity had to be verified by a digital platform that deals with identity. Is St. Vincent looking into or will accept those businesses that have been started to digitize that verification process? So for example, for a PSWIFT, they will plug into an external API that will they have biometric identity verification. So I had to scan my face, scan my passport, scan my ID, and then they will take either a few hours or a few days to verify if I am who I say I am. Would St. Vincent accept those digital platforms as acceptable for identity verification?
I believe that that time is coming, yes. In light of the digital age that we currently live in, and in light of these new and emerging products, and the fact that we do acknowledge that there will be non-face-to-face relationships, I think that that time is soon coming in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Currently, the FATF does have guidance, which was published recently on digital identification, and the St. Vincent and the Grenadines may likely have to adopt some similar guidance in the future, notwithstanding, however, that there is nothing currently in place in the law which says that your identification documents can be in digital form. The financial institutions, service providers, etc., can make adequate provisions after having assessed the risk behind it. So if it is, you know that your customer is not a face-to-face customer, immediately there is a higher risk involved there. You will have to, the financial institution that is, or the service provider can then perhaps invest in some technology of some kind, or obtain some type of system which facilitates the verification of digital IDs, which are submitted by non-face-to-face customers. So I wouldn't say that it's something which is strictly prohibited at this time. It can very well be done, because the financial institutions are under, and I say financial institutions loosely, but it applies to, of course, any of the service providers that fall within the AML-CFT regulations. They are required to conduct a risk assessment of their customers, their products, the means of delivery of their services, as well as the geographical risk of customers. And by virtue of doing this particular risk-based assessment, you then make provisions adequately to mitigate your risks. So if it is that your customer, you deem a particular customer to be of a lower risk, then you can apply simplified due diligence measures. Whereas if it is that a customer is deemed to be of a higher risk, you're expected to apply enhanced due diligence measures. And as I indicated, non-face-to-face presents an inherently high risk. So the financial institution service provider would want to ensure that it has the appropriate systems which can safely essentially verify that identity, the digital identity that's submitted.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question for you, Marlo. And we kind of talked about Dcash a little earlier, but in terms of PaySwift itself, do you think that Dcash is a competitor, or would you consider it something that you can see working hand in hand with PaySwift?
Any payment gateway that enters St. Vincent market is a competitor. But that does not mean that we cannot work hand in hand. I mean, that is a relationship we'll gladly welcome. I mean, at the end of the day, they would have certain things or maybe even better relationship with the banking industry here in St. Vincent and Grenadines and throughout the entire OECS countries. So that is something we'll definitely welcome. Yes, we do have a strong customer base.
All right. I guess jumping off of that, I don't know how much of it you want to go into, but in terms of the more, because we are an ISOC, right? So in terms of the more technical side of how your product works, what can you expect as a customer who wants to get involved with PaySwift? What would it look like for somebody who's signing up? Or what do you experience when you are doing transactions, that kind of thing? Yeah, as a customer.
Okay, so we've had a lot of feedback from customers. They enjoy the sign up process because it's not long. When it comes to the usage of PaySwift, one of the things that we took a lot of pride in and we've revamped over the years was basically the user experience. And we've made it our number one priority. We have always talked to our customers to get the feedback, to have an idea of what it is they like, they don't like, what it is tickles their fancy. You know, we try to get everything out there. So for example, some of the features that they enjoy are the instant features that they will get with PaySwift. For example, buying something. For example, they're able to see the bookings, they're able to pay for it, they're able to see on the back end what is actually going on with their business. So they're able to have a statistical review of their business itself. So that is one of the perks that PaySwift gives businesses. One of the perks that it gives its user is that I would tend to forget my wallet, but I would never forget my phone. And PaySwift has went beyond that, and we've already started to look in, and we've created the first kiosk in St. Vincent and Grenadines. As in locally, we created it, right? And that's one of the things that we love about PaySwift, the fact that we're so diverse. We could change things, make things, because we built it ourselves. So persons are now enjoying the fact that, for example, in the future, you'll get something done. That's the whole. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Marlo. I have a question here, but I don't know. More time we have on this microphone. So just give us some patience at home. But if you are at home and you have a burning question, don't keep it to yourself and burn yourself. You know, you drop it in the chat, drop it in the Q&A, or drop it in Facebook where we are live, or on YouTube where we're also live. If you feel a little bit adventurous and brave, like our friend if you feel adventurous and brave like Maurice, you can also raise your hand and get live in the action with us. So once again, we have Miss James from the FSA and we have Mr. Brown from PaySwift, and they're discussing the theme, the use of emerging technologies for disaster resilience, with a particular spin on finance tonight. So if you have any questions that relate to the FSA or to PaySwift or to the topic at large, we'll try to see how we could best answer it. All right. So hold on a second. Hello, hello. 1, 3, 4, 5. Hearing me? Hello, hello. All right. All right. And we're back. Thanks for bearing with us, guys. So while we had a little break, as you probably would have seen, our panelists had a lively discussion. It's actually still going on. No, I was just saying, I don't know if you guys wanted to, because it sounded like a good discussion. I don't know if you guys wanted to share that with the audience or if it's not for their ears. All right. That was a PaySwift FSA secret discussion. Okay. So another question for the FSA. I just wanted to know exactly if it's something, well, how does the FSA go about its job? Because I'm assuming that you don't have infinite resources, and there's a fair amount of financial institutions in St. Vincent. So how do you enforce the various regulations that govern the credit unions, that govern, well, you say you focus on non-banking, right? So how do you enforce the legislation that govern the credit unions and investment banks, etc.?
Okay, so the FSA is divided into several departments, which essentially take responsibility for various types of entities. So we do have the credit union money service business department, and within each department, there are line managers, there are as well examiners. And the department takes essentially the responsibility of administering the pieces of legislation and essentially ensuring compliance. And how we go about doing that, within the various pieces of legislation, they speak to prudential aspects of regulation, such as filing of quarterly returns, as well as audited financial statements at year end. And we also would be utilizing certain international standards in carrying out our regulation as well. For the insurance companies, for instance, there are insurance core principles. For the international banks, we utilize the Basel principles. So there are certain international standards which we utilize in ensuring that the entities within the jurisdiction, that they are complying with that, as well as that they are meeting the requirements in the various pieces of legislation. So the credit unions within the Cooperative Societies Act, there are certain provisions which they must comply with. The money service businesses, same thing within the MSB Act, international banks as well, same thing. And these things, the requirements relate to, for instance, meeting certain capital requirements, having sufficient liquidity, things of that nature, as well as the governance and management of these institutions being fit and proper to do so. And we also, in carrying out our functions, would be required to engage in risk-based supervision. So for instance, it means that we have an understanding utilizing a particular framework as to which entities are deemed higher risk, and by virtue of the high risk nature of certain entities, we would focus more resources on regulating and supervising those entities versus the others who may be deemed lower risk. So that is essentially it in a nutshell, I think.
All right, so thank you very much for that answer. We're coming near to the end of our discussion this evening. And well, what I just wanted to know at this point is, do you guys have any questions for each other that you think, based on the presentations and the answers that they've given so far, you want a little bit more knowledge on?
Not really a question per se, but I realize what the FSA is doing. And like we have said before, we've always had communication. They've always had an open door to us understanding exactly what we're going through. And I know that they're working towards something. I don't know how long it would take. So I don't really have a question to work with us. I mean, as a small company coming out, we're faced with a lot of challenges. As a small company, we realize that at the beginning of PISSWIFT, a lot of pastors are going to look at PISSWIFT and say, that's not something needed. But we've had that before when we just started PISSWIFT. That's not something needed. That makes no sense. And now today, it makes so much sense that we have a problem. Right? So it's good to know that they're trying something. We'll always try to work with you, try to see how best to deal with the situations at hand. I I don't have, like I said, I don't have a question per se. It would have, the only question I had, but was already answered by Mr. Brown, would have been how long the framework would have taken. Right? So that's the only question I had. Yeah, that's the only question I had.
Well, I don't have a question per se either. Just to crave your indulgence and ask for patience, because as indicated from the outset, this is new and for all of us. So it will take a little bit of time, but we are committed to tailoring regulation in order to mitigate the risk of the product, as I indicated, without imposing any undue regulatory burdens and without having the effect of stifling innovation and being a deterrent, essentially, for legitimate business people who wish to set up these types of businesses in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
All right. So with that, I think we've come to the end of a productive and useful IGF this evening. Well, the first session of our IGF for 2021. And I just want to thank the panelists tonight. And I want to thank Mr. Willis Williams for his remarks earlier. I want to thank Pastor Keriko for his prayer. And I want to thank Mr. Masango for his words of encouragement, starting us off on the right foot. And Ms. James for your expounding of what the FSA does. And I think we left here with a little bit more knowledge. You know, I think we hear the term FSA and sometimes we don't have a face to put to it. And we understand the challenges that you guys are facing. It's a new world, and it seems like you guys are working towards making St. Vincent a part of that. And I want to thank Mr. Brown, not myself, Mr. Marlo Brown, for being here and telling us what PaySwift is about and taking us through what they're trying to accomplish as a young company, relatively young company in St. Vincent that's doing something fresh and innovative. So, and I want to thank you guys for tuning in, for asking your questions, and thanks for giving me the opportunity, the IGF team and the ISOC team, for being a moderator tonight. I'm Andrew Brown, and this is the end. Thanks.